Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's current discussion topic. As voted by the community, we are going to be dedicating the next few discussions to the topics of society and culture, which obviously is a pretty broad category that incorporates a hell of a lot of different things. So, we're going to be kind of breaking it down and tackling different aspects of it in different discussions. So, this first discussion is going to be looking at society and its form and function. And we're going to be looking into, what is a society, how do they form, general characteristics, different societal layouts and types that you might find like IRL or like through various different means in sort of a sci-fi sense. What is a class system? Whether your nation might have a rigid system or not. What social mobility is within your nation, and how it might impact your society if you have less or more. We're going to look at societal impacts on a nation. So, things that will be quite key in your society that will clearly affect everything else, or things that everything else is going on that's going to impact your society. How to generally write societal upheaval and change. We're going to look at extreme society types that you might find in Ancerious and roleplay, like hive minds, etc. And we're going to be going over some examples of good societies in Ancerios. So, what is a society? Well, we live in a society. I have to say the line because otherwise people are going to get upset with me. So, effectively, a society is just a bunch of people living together in a like ordered community in some fashion. That's it. Thanks for coming to my TED talk. But yeah, that is more or less what it is. It is the general societal structure of the world that we live in. Effectively, this encompasses everything. It encompasses government, military, economics, culture, you name it. And bear in mind that society is kind of such this big nebulous term that it can basically almost operate, I'll put it like a fractal. So you can zoom in to a family unit, yeah, in a single household, and they will live in an ordered community. That in itself is a society. Or you could zoom out to the general town or village. That's a society. You could zoom out to the country. That's a society. Or you could zoom out to the entire planet. That is a society. And you could zoom out further to, effectively an entire nation. And that in itself is a society spanning countless different worlds, etc. So it's this kind of very zoom in and out catch-all term. And yeah, the question is really sort of how do they form and their general characteristics, I guess, because again, this is a very nebulous thing. How they form, well, I mean, it's natural. It is natural to form societies. Even basic hunter gatherers and whatnot have a form of society. They know what they're going to do. They generally make plans together. They live communally. They divvy out tasks between what people are actually good at based on skills and what's good for the group. And that's done more or less, on all scales. But you know, societies are something that can mingle effectively quite well. So even though we can say that societies could take all these different forms and whatnot, they tend to form maybe in sort of in like Ancerios and sort of sci-fi roleplay sort of settings when different groups of individuals who have their existing communities and existing societies blend together to form something new. Uh, be that as in a bunch of colonists who are effectively, working together in some sort of joint environment. They might create something new as a amalgamation of the various different nations. And you might get things where society of individuals from one nation are cut off or develop independently and therefore form their own unique system, their own unique community. Um, that's kind of how I would say they form overall, other than just they spring up out of the natural order. Uh, IRL, animals have societies. You don't have to, say that it's exclusive to specific advanced life. The natural world is full of this sort of stuff as well. So it's not really a question of how do they form in terms of like actual sort of small tangible mechanical ways, but they just kind of spring up out of the natural order of things, of trying to bring order to otherwise chaotic means, and knowing that everyone working together for a greater cause is going to further the species much more than a bunch of different people lone wolfing things and getting eaten by predators effectively. Um, it's all about coexistence in the end. It's all about making something that is able to coexist, further species, and generally, you know, coming out better for everyone involved. So, obviously, I could say that general characteristics of a society is coexistence. It is the furthering of goals that are unified goals across many different people. And it's generally bringing order to uh, everyday sort of goings on, I suppose. Whether that is planning your next family meal to coming up with, the next economic forecast for your entire nation's trade exports and imports, yeah? So, really, there's crazy amount of, like, broadness that I can go into for this. But, in terms of looking at it from like a roleplay standpoint, from nation roleplay, for example, in Ancerios, your general characteristics of a society is going to be obviously what we just talked about, but you're going to have some form of government, so some sort of overview of how your nation is ruled from the top down. You're going to have some form of culture, a shared culture that is integrated into your nation. You're going to have some form of economic system that allows goods and services to flow either between different parts of this society or different individuals and the like. And you're going to have probably some sort of perhaps military force as well for protection, or to further again the goals of everyone involved. So again, yeah, it's a pretty big and generalized thing. If anyone wants to chip in, like Vic or Blue or Boomy, feel free. But I feel like this is going to be a very generalized overview sort of discussion series of topics. But I will do my best to. I think the question section of these are going to be more important than anything. So, okay, different societal layouts and types. Well, there's obviously going to be your kind of like basic, hunter-gatherer type things, where it's just different groups of people going around living mouth to mouth effectively from the land. You're going to have your sort of typical pre-industrial society as such. You're going to have your industrial society, where your society is geared towards industrializing itself, furthering its economic output and its productive capability to be able to bring itself to a point where it can sustain itself and improve the general day-to-day living of everyone involved. And you've got your kind of like post-industrial, I suppose, which is, you've built everything up and you're past your massive output of trying to throw coal onto the fire and make your tools or whatever and sell them. You're there to now effectively enjoy the fruits of your labour, so to say. Obviously, this then splits up into the kind of like information age, which you kind of have today, where using a lot of digitization, lots of distribution of information and technology, And then I guess this will expand more into the future when you get to sort of like pre-FTL and post-FTL society, where you can spread your society and your community and your way of life to other planets, expand, use those resources, and then use them to further your own goals. Um, but yeah, you obviously also get like kind of like older versions where you've got a very pastoral or agrarian societies that are focused around the cultivation of large amounts of crops or herd animals and the sustaining yourself through that. Um, in Ancerios, I guess the most common is going to be some sort of information post FTL. Um, there are going to be many different types of layouts in terms of, you know, is your society one that is geared towards the individual, or is it geared towards more of a collective whole? Is it more a case of uh, bottom heavy, where it favors day to day people and the workers, or is it quite top heavy, where there are set ruling classes that are very stringent about what they can and can't do, and do they control the workers through these methods, etc. Something to note at this point is, as you can tell, with society being a very broad topic, and obviously we're going to be talking about culture and that as well. Society, because it encapsulates so many different things, is very dependent on also what your nation's government is, what your nation's culture is, what your nation's economic situation is, what and how everything kind of in the nation integrates into itself. Because the society is kind of like the overarching framework where everything kind of slots in underneath. So if you're going to have a very uh top heavy kind of authoritarian state, or your society is going to be very probably collectively driven, where it's for the benefit of the state more than anything. It's going to have a very restrictive economy. It's going to have a very set culture on what's kind of accepted or not within a very controlled environment, and there's going to be quite sort of stringent layout for how the society is going to be, rather than, for example, a very laissez-faire capitalist sort of society like modern day nations, where you're going to have all kinds of cultures mixing, you're going to have lots of immigration, you're going to have a wide diverse array of political parties that are all vying for control, a very broad economic situation where all kinds of things are being imported or exported, with little interference from the government, for example, and a very kind of chaotic day-to-day society where you've got people from all kinds of different walks of life in various states of financial and, I guess, political capability. So your layout and your type is very much kind of defined. I wouldn't say that you should ever go to a sort of a when creating your nation and say, hey, yeah, I'm going to have this kind of society, and then build within that framework. This kind of topic is more of a broader thing where, you've created your government, you've created your general kind of special source for your nation, you've created your, like, general culture, how your people are going to be, for example, how they came to be. You've got your sort of, like, economic overview, how the nation works. This then kind of forms what sort of society you are, and help sort of temper the idealism and ideologies that you've got within that. Um, Obviously, there's sort of extreme types that we'll sort of go over later, but societies are so wide and diverse that I kind of can't give you an easy list of sort of like what might constitute, because in Ancerios there are so many different types of nations, and each one has a society that's like slightly different due to particular restrictions on information, for example, with the Selenicans, or it might be a very top-down controlled society, but due to capital, for example, or it could be a very politically diverse array thanks to Natar. It's all very up in the air. Um, so let's go over some sort of societal segments that can kind of be a bit more defined and can sort of help out in this instance. So the first, I kind of guessing, a major part of a societal sort of skeletal framework is your class system. Now, yes, this is kind of intertwined with culture, but I'm going to do it in this discussion more than culture, because culture can kind of go over, why you have a class system and how it developed. But class systems are where people and parts of your population are within a social strata of your nation. Are they working class people that don't have much to their name, that go out every day to go into these big factories and produce starships or other consumer goods that your nation then either uses or sells onto the open market? Are they middle class, where they've got access to much more capable education and they can then go and do the more, I guess, like white/blue collar jobs, depending on where you're from, that then, oversee different aspects of the more middle management and overview and more enlightened sort of parts of your nation? And then do you have an upper class where it is sort of politicians or the wealthy who get to enjoy the fruits of all of their labour or someone else's labour, and effectively make up the sort of top social stratas? How do all of these intermingle? Do you have a very loose system like IRL, where working class can intermingle with middle class, and middle class can intermingle with upper class, and kind of what fits the definitions can be pretty blurry? Or do you have a very stratified society, which is you are a worker, you are going to have access to what workers have access to, therefore you are doing this with your life, or you are born into this specific caste of society, therefore you're going to go to university, get this education, and go into aerospace design and manufacture, for example. So, look at that from a different perspective of what tiers are there in your nation that focus on these different things. Again, if you're a very open nation, very diverse, very non-stratified, then it's not going to be too much of a worry. But if you're a very authoritarian, very dictatorial, very surveillance state that kind of wants to manage every aspect of its society and its people, if it treats them as another resource, is probably going to have many different classes that are dedicated to certain things that it then closely monitors, for example. And those classes are going to get very specific roles, they're going to get very specific resources to keep them going, and there's going to be very little movement between those rungs, so to say. I guess this is kind of a... Actually, I'll touch upon it on the extreme society section, because there's going to obviously be the question of like, well, but my society doesn't actually have a class system. But we'll get to that later, where I can then have a mental breakdown. So, with these class systems involved and sort of what makes what, there is something called social mobility. And you may or may not have heard of that term before, but social mobility is a general ability of the population to move between social stratas, to move between these classes, yeah? For example, if you today work very, very, very hard and accumulate lots of wealth and capital and resources, you will rise to a middle class person and then to an upper class. Not that that can actually happen with modern society, but you get the point. You're moving up the ranks. You're going from working class upwards, yeah? So, or in the same vein, it's basically a case of, you have just been slapped with a massive fine or something, therefore your upper class family is now bankrupt and they have to go and work at like Burger King or whatever, and now they're like they've fallen to working class people. So having this social mobility kind of indicates how much people are moving between these different classes. Now, in a sort of society like modern day, for example, social mobility isn't something that's controlled. It's also not something that is kind of a definable, easy sort of like, oh yeah, well, we're going to try and raise these people or demote these people, etc. It just kind of happens organically within a nation. But again, if you have a much more stratified society which is very controlling, you might not have any social mobility or very little social mobility. It might be a case of, yes, you're a worker who's out on these factory floors, but if you're displaying a keen intellect that allows you to display a capacity for understanding and managing in a much more capable fashion, you might be promoted socially, for example, to a management caste, for example. Um, in the same vein, if you're born into a society with an strata that's basically like, you've got to be the best at the best at, for example, ruling and general kind of like management of resources, and you're a complete and utter dumbass who can't do that in any way, shape, or form, you might just get promoted to the factory lines because that's what you're good for. So or you might not want people moving at all between your classes. Again, if you're a sort of like a semi-feudalistic society where you've got this small, very wealthy upper class that are controlling these very poor, very impoverished lower classes, you don't want these like commoners to rise up the ranks and become lords and ladies and have access to all of this wealth that could have been rightfully yours. You don't want them rising up that, so you're going to block any kind of path that they have to, social mobility. So how you sort of go about that is really up to you and depends on your nation. But I find that kind of what your classes are, even if they're quite loosely defined, and what social mobility there is in your nation quite helps define a society and gives you a nice internal baseline, because it shows the natural ebb and flow of your people and what you can expect day to day. Like, if I go to any one of your nations and think, oh, what's it going to be like if I live there? What can I expect to do over the course of my life? Because if I'm just going to work like 24/7 in a factory and I'm not going to really get any benefits from it, I'm not going to like rise in stature, I'm not going to make lots of money, well, like, I don't really want to go to your nation, sort of thing. But that in turn gives me a very good idea about what your society is like and what your nation's like overall to be within. At the same time, if I'm like, oh, I could go to your nation and, like, through hard work and toil or through other nefarious means, I can immediately kind of join your upper class and have access to the high life, then that tells me a lot about your nation, and it also makes other people go like, oh, I want to go there, for example. And again, you can then tie this into other parts of your nation, where if you have very high social mobility, you most likely have quite high immigration as well. Because if people can very easily work in your nation and have access to this much more affluent way of living, through that, they're going to want to go there because that gives them better prospects for life. In the same vein, if there's not a lot of chance for natural progression up the social chain to have a better life in your nation, well, people might just leave. Like, you might have a problem with emigration where people are trying to go elsewhere. So this is one thing where you can kind of use class systems and social mobilities to help, define other aspects that you might not have thought about before. Um, but yeah, I don't know if, again, Vic or Blue or Boomy want to put in anything on that particular subject, but none of them are unmuting, so okay. I will continue my vague and insane rant. Um, and a key thing to note here. Hold on, let me have a drink. what's better, is you don't have to just have it as these like workers, middle class, upper class. You can have many different stratas or castes or social rungs within those specific areas where you can have, like lower upper class, middle upper class, or you can have distinct things of like the upper class. You've then got like the actual proper kind of heads, the main families, for example. You've got specific landowners or whatnot. You've got all sorts, for example, of you know that could be going on within that. Different middle classes dedicated to different things and the like, and you could really stratify your nation if you really want to. Somebody has mentioned that high social mobility doesn't guarantee lack of immigration. Russia has a relatively high social mobility between lower and middle class. The thing is that both these stratas are in a shit place. That's true. However, you will note that Russia actually does have quite a seriously high case of immigration where, like, well, they have a lot of emigration, they don't have a lot of immigration because while, yes, there is a good chance of social mobility within Russia, which is questionable given their situation, their overall society is extremely, let's just say, corrupt. It's very controlled, oligarchic. Therefore, yes, while you can technically rise up the ranks very quickly, your gains might be taken away at a moment's notice. And so, yeah, like, while there can be a lot of social mobility upwards in Russia, there's also a lot of social mobility downwards in Russia. And that is why you've seen so many oligarchs leave. That's why you've seen so many middle class people leave. And it's also why you've seen so many working class people leave. Because nobody wants to live there. Um, and, but, yeah, and that's a very good point. Russia also had very extreme social mobility following the fall of the USSR, as a lot of people divided state resources and became entrepreneurs. It's fair enough. But yeah, like, I'm not saying that, if you have high social mobility, you immediately have high immigration. Like, it's one of those things that you can consider and look at and be like, oh, well, I've got quite an open and a respectable nation and I have very high social mobility. Maybe people want to go there. It's just one of those kind of things that you can look at from a different lens and link to other bits and pieces. One thing in nation building that is kind of the big elephant in the room is that when you start writing big advanced nation sheets that delve into things like social mobility, social strata, culture, deep government, deep economy, etc., you start looking at other things where you go, oh, I'm going to write about my society today, and the next thing you know, you've gone down 15 rabbit holes and you're now writing 60 different, like, relevant topics. Everything's linked. So it's one of those things where you kind of have to look at things in various different contextual lights. But yeah, and yeah, definitely, social mobility is absolutely a factor, but economic situation, stability, etc., is very important as well. So, societal impacts on your nation. Well, if you've got this is kind of like one of those, I guess, brief topics that I can touch on, but it can also be quite broad depending on how you look at it. We've always kind of said in Ancerious and in these discussions, if you have X, that means that you shouldn't discount Y, sort of thing. So if you are building a society that has, as we've said, maybe a very stratified, very set sort of social classes, and there isn't much social mobility, for example, you're probably not going to have a very open or free society. And you might have a very heavily governmental controlled economy, layout, etc. Now, that isn't always the case, but it's one of those things where if you are building your society in a certain way, it should reflect on the rest of your nation. Because if you say that you have a super duper stratified class system with a very overarching sort of top down society, yeah, you're not really then going to turn around to me and in the same submission or, nation writing tell me that you've actually got super high social mobility and people aren't really controlled that much, and the people at the bottom, the workers, have a really big say in what happens. Because if you've already told me that your society is extremely stratified, well, what's to stop people in specific stratas from just, social mobility somewhere else? And if you've already said, hey, yeah, I've got a really top-down nation where I've got a very kind of like powerful upper class and they control most of the power, but if you also tell me that the workers also have, the lower rungs of society also have a lot of power and most of the control, that doesn't really line up. So make sure that when you have your kind of societal layout, that it reflects in your politics, that it reflects in your economy, that it reflects in your culture and such, but also vice versa. If you have specific things in politics or specific things in an economy, it should reflect in your society. Again, you can't tell me that you've got a very open and fair society that encourages social mobility if you've got like some giga authoritarian dictatorship that has absolutely tight control on the economy and doesn't really permit much political discourse. Like, okay, how do you have a very fair and open society if that's the case? You know what I mean? So this is a very everything in this is very tied into everything else. So please, again, take into consideration sort of contextual situations, but enjoy effectively the different aspects of thinking about it all. It can get quite complicated, so if necessary, write bits down and then try and sort of tackle each contextual tie-in one at a time. Don't just overload yourself with like a billion things and look like that guy with the yarn and the pins trying to connect all the dots together, because you'll quickly blow your brains out due to that. So yeah, your economic situation, your political situation, your cultural situation, hell, even your military situation and your geopolitical situation is going to have an impact on your society. Because let's face it, if you are in a really fucking tight situation geopolitically, where your nation is facing an invasion and your political landscape know that there's a lot of subversive activities being undertaken by other nations inside your own society, and your military is not in a particularly great state of affairs, and your economy has previously been like super open and very easily manipulated on the market due to foreign investments and whatnot, your government is going to have to make a decision to possibly change your entire sort of society, where you might have to go onto a war footing. They might have to control the economy. Your military will have to be revamped. Your cultural and societal norms and your sort of like political freedoms and I guess like freedoms of speech and that might have to be curtailed to overcome these specific situations and stop this whole possible invasion or what's going on, and the undermining of your nation through subversive activities, whether economic or societal. So this will obviously happen to impact your nation. Writing these, however, is somewhat tricky because it takes time sitting down and writing up a coherent society in your nation, including, politics, economy, culture, blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of like piecing together a really nice jigsaw and then sitting down and going, oh, that looks really good, actually. I'm glad I got that done. And then something happens in roleplay or story that means you have to rejig it. So it's going to have an impact. And it's kind of like breaking up that jigsaw. and then re-putting it back together in a different way, or merging it with another jigsaw. And it can be hard writing that because you don't want to have to rewrite all your internal, situations and whatnot. And that's fine. Remember, it's up to you how much societal change is something, that's going to affect your nation. But you should respect that major goings on in the galaxy or the story will affect you in one way or another. That's just how it works. For example, the global market collapse. The galactic market collapse. Ancerious is a bit bigger than a globe. That impacted everyone, galaxy wide. That had societal impacts on various nations. You saw it across the galaxy where nations became less interventionist. They pulled out economic stops with particular trade partners or whatnot due to ideological lines. You saw some nations start to focus on war economy because they believed that conflict was coming. You saw some nations crack down on their populations because of various cultural shifts to do with ideologies and, also shifts in their population due to the fact that there were less goods that were happening on the galactic market. Suddenly people weren't getting all of the funds that they wished for example, or being unable to conduct their trade or their livelihoods, and this caused issues. And you just kind of roll with it in the fact that take what would happen logically from that point and apply it to your nation. Even single RPs can have an effect. Like, for example, if you're doing a diplomatic RP with a particular person, for example, me and Boomy are doing a Diplo RP, and something goes wrong, or like we decide to have something happen where the relations with both nations gets like completely screwed up. Well, the obvious societal impacts from that might be that there will be a reduction in trade. That could impact the livelihoods of some people in our nation and cause some political backlash. It could even lead to some sort of geopolitical drama. It could lead to, again, like, maybe even war or something, where our societies then have to sort of reorient themselves to deal with the ongoing situation. So, if there is something that is impacting your nation and your society, just kind of think to yourself, all right, well, how would, if I applied that situation to a modern day nation like, the United States or the UK or wherever you might be from, think about how it would affect your nation and your livelihood right now today, and then apply that to your nation. And again, societal impacts and upheavals don't have to be just complete and utter, like, oh, well, somebody sneezed at a diplomatic conference today and the other guy got so offended that, there's now going to be a complete genocidal war and my nation is now going to have to be, like, fanatic militarists who will have to fight to the death. It's not going to be like that, and your society's not going to 180 overnight, but you're going to have to think, especially because I know that one of the big tropes in nation roleplay is civil wars. And civil wars play a major kind of part in internal story writing. Now, civil wars are not to be taken lightly, okay? Civil wars don't happen unless there is no other choice, yeah? A society will always try to fix its own problems in a way that isn't going to completely tear itself apart. Because if a society has got to the point where fighting itself is the only way to try and resolve its problems, then, Jesus Christ, it's probably pretty fucking bad, and the society is already massively changed. Yeah? So, if there are outside factors that are affecting your society, you should write that. You should write their effects. If there are internal factors that are, going on where different things are happening internally with different power players that are, vying for control over the nation internally, there's always going to be sort of subversive elements. There's going to be small stuff going on. Even if there's no civil war, you're going to have maybe fundamentalist groups or terrorists or, you know, different political parties that are going to be kind of peddling, trying to get more sway over the population. And this is obviously going to impact your nation's stability. It's going to affect your political scene. It's going to affect your economics. It's going to affect your military because they're going to be swayed by different aspects of your society, and it's going to affect your day-to-day sort of people's lives. And when it kind of triggers things that will change society overall, I guess the average person doesn't typically care too much because at the end of the day, the general population won't really give a shit until they are the ones getting stamped on. Okay? This is a very general overview, so there's going to be exceptions, but for example, in modern day, the general situation in the West, for example, at least in, say, the UK and the US, I can't speak for the rest of Europe, but it does seem similar, is the general population is being effectively, kicked in the shins repeatedly, but it's being done very slowly. It's one of those situations where if you place a frog in non-boiling water and slowly heat up the pan, it will just boil instead of, immediately jumping out if you throw it into hot water. And so you've got these societal changes that are being introduced very, very slowly and carefully so that you can squeeze as much capital and funding out of the general population, state assets, military, civilian sectors, you name it, as possible to siphon to the rich and the upper class without causing the general population to be like, oh my god, they just completely got rid of our pensions, or oh my god, they just completely privatized our entire healthcare, or oh my god, they just got rid of our healthcare entirely, or, anything that would day-to-day life make somebody go, hold on a minute, I can't live properly anymore. Because the moment you take away somebody's individual kind of freedoms and right to, live as they want to live, they're going to go for you, and it's going to seem like, actual revolt or civil war or whatever is actually a tempting option. So they do it slowly to stop this from being the case, because it causes the least disruption of society. So people don't realise when their rights are being eroded away. They don't realise when their public services are being eroded away. They might notice it now and again and grumble about it, but by the time that it becomes a really serious issue, it's already too late and everything's already been done. That's the case here in the UK, for example. It looks like the case in the US, but, I could be wrong. And it looks like it's the case elsewhere as well. So, societal upheaval tends to take time. There are obviously many exceptions to that, where things could just sort of happen out of the blue and kind of go crazy. But for the most part, crazy sort of society-changing stuff doesn't tend to happen overnight. It tends to take time. It tends to have some sort of contextual build-up, or have some sort of outside or internal kind of trigger, more or less. Swing brings up a really good one, which is effectively the former Eastern Bloc when the wall fell. Those societies suddenly got catapulted into this non-super stratified, ultra-controlled, ultra-authoritarian environment to, suddenly we're all free and we can basically do what we want. Suddenly, society completely changed overnight, 5 years, which is a very short time frame for a national sort of scale. Everything just changed. Everything started completely privatizing. There was entrepreneurship. There were complete revisions to constitutions, political parties formed, suddenly there was free press, people could do what they wanted, and everything changed. And, it all kind of went okay. Another good example is the whole situation with Iran, where there was the whole political situation where they brought down the Shah, and so everyone was working together to bring down the corrupt government. And then the next thing they knew is that the the Islamist fundamentalists had infiltrated all of the key sections of government, and the next thing you know, uh, Iran is now even more authoritarian and insane than it was before, for example. So, if you're going to write, it needs to have context. Don't just have civil wars or major societal upheavals where they change ideologies or governments or, whatever overnight. Just give it a reason. Don't have it just be out of the blue just because you got bored. Come up with some cool story for it. Why are things changing? Why, even, slowly or quickly. And societies change over time. It's just how things happen, Everything changes, everything evolves, everything develops. So that should be reflected in your nation's internals. So I'm not asking you to constantly update your nation sheet with how the economic situation on Timbuktu 9 or whatever has influenced your political party to vote in a particular. I'm not interested in that sort of thing, and I'm not asking you to constantly update your stuff with it. All I'm asking is that the best way to show societal impacts or whatnot is that when major galaxy affecting stuff happens, like the galactic market crashes, or the start of the Third Ancerious War, or the massacres in Corona, or any number of things that are clearly far-reaching, to write maybe a news post about how it's affecting your nation. Or mention it in an RP post somewhere where you basically say that, maybe there's civil unrest in your nation because suddenly, the economic situation has crashed and people don't have access to all their funds anymore, or, they can't do business as well as they previously did, or maybe something is affecting the current government's popularity because they've been forced to take a stance that is not particularly well adopted by the rest of the population, or just any number of different things. Just as long as you write somewhere that it gets represented, news posts, RP posts, whatnot, that's fine. You don't have to just go and rewrite your entire nation sheet, okay? The only time you really need to do that is when, obviously, there's a massive civil war or something happens to your nation that causes it to massively change. In which case, yeah, it's probably a good idea to go through, because if your peace-loving democracy is now an ultra-militarist, authoritarian dictatorship, it's probably going to be a bit hard for me to go to your sheet and still find the peace-loving democracy and just be like, wait a minute, how does that work? So, yeah, give it context, have a good reason, write as in-depth as you wish. You could do it as little as in-depth or as much in-depth as you want. So, the next section is extreme societies. Now, the top one on this list is hive minds, which is typically the most extreme sort of societies that we go to on these lists. Hive minds are an interesting one because they technically might not have a class system, and they might not have any social mobility either, and they might have a very alien form of layout. And in a way, they're not really a society either, because if a society is a collection of different individuals coming together for a greater good, a hive mind is one individual. It's not many different individuals. Now, there might be several different hive minds within a hive mind, in which case it may be a form of primitive society, but a hive mind overall is not actually a society. And in this regard, you will find that it doesn't have much in a form of government. It doesn't really have much in a form of an economy. It doesn't have much in a form of culture, for example. Unless you do it in very specific ways. And hive minds can come in any number of different shapes and forms, especially in Ancerios, because the various, I guess, branches of a hive mind can be either very set socially and, well, not socially, but I guess biologically designed for very certain things within the individual, or you can have you know, a hive mind where it's all just one being, where they're all the same, and yeah, whatnot. Now, obviously, some hive minds can be kind of like a consensus base, where it's individuals who can make up a hive mind. This will be a form of society. Obviously, that should be reflected in your nation quite heavily. Um, but for the most parts, you know, Vic, do you want to expand on the hive mind law, society wise, and the different types of hive minds?
Yes. So I think that's a hive mind, as it is like rigorously defined in Ancerious, which is just this like a multitude of beings that all share the same psyche. It's not really a society, because the individual bodies are not the locus of consciousness. They are not the thing that is thinking. The thing that is thinking is this hive mind that is above them. So it is, and I've written it as such, and it has been written multiple times like that in the series, that hive minds don't behave like cultures, they don't behave like nations, they behave like individual people with their own idiosyncrasies and their own decisions and internal psychology. The things that the actual like organisms that make up a hive mind and the differentiation with them are not really a social stratification as much as your like red blood cells are a social class. Like it doesn't make sense to think of your like neurons as the ruling class of your body. No, they're just like different kinds of the same thing with different functionalities that all are ultimately like secondary to a whole, which is you. So I don't, and also like hive minds generally don't have an important thing in actually stratified societies, which is class conflict or class disagreements. In a hive mind or like in a human body, there is never a disagreement on like the cells on my liver never unionized to tell my brain to stop drinking, or like the bug people of Ishvitin 4 have a class that they have a hive mind, and there's a type of bug whose sole purpose is burrowing. The burrowing bugs are not gonna like identify with their class, with their social class, because that's not a social class. That's just like a biological feature that they were born with, and they are subordinated to a higher will. You can get like variants of that. It's like the mice who were like quasi individuals, but ultimately there were the real subject was the hive mind itself, or the Eocene, where the hive mind kind of works backward, where it's a whole bunch of individuals who do have social classes, create this vague and very non-subjective hive quasi mind. They agree on a bunch of stuff, and it influences their thoughts in a certain direction. But I don't think you can call the Eocene a hive mind. They're like they have a lot of they are very interconnected psychically, but they are still like subjects. They can still disagree.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's Obviously, yeah, you do get the hive minds where they're much more kind of individualistic, and of course, in those instances, you're going to have a much more typical society in a way. But yeah, with the whole like I guess kind of a generic hive mind, big brain controlling all of the body parts, it is a very individual base. And
So it's
personally,
there is like another thing that
oh yeah,
I had to add about hive minds, if you allow me,
yeah, go for it.
which is when making hive mind societies or like hive mind subjects, you have to think: does the consciousness itself exist? A, in all of the individuals, like it's like a distributed consciousness, or B, does it exist in some like place above the individuals, like the Scion field or an overmind echo or whatever, which is going to change the nature of the hive mind a lot, because if it exists in this kind of transcendental space, then the actual physical cells of the hive mind are going to matter even less. However, if the hive mind is solely contained in the brains of the like little subjects that make it up, then environmental factors are gonna like influence it much more. For example, the mice. The mice only existed within the collective of mice themselves. If all the mice felt cold, were in like an environment with cold temperature, the hive mind itself was gonna feel that and gonna be affected with that. Yeah, it was gonna like organize its individuals to feel less cold. However, if like some like terminate hive mind is in a cold temperature, it's not gonna give a fuck because it exists like above in like a psionic space that isn't really feeling that cold, and it's just seeing like, oh, some of the bugs are dying of cold. I'm gonna modify them, but it's not actually like feeling its environment.
Yeah, I like it. So, touching on the whole thing of like a hive mind that's kind of just got one big overmind and everything in it is just an organism. That's kind of the only society, in my opinion, where there's going to be a classless society, because we've had a few people who have come to Ancerios and they've tried to make a sort of like, they've kind of been like, oh well, my society doesn't actually have any different classes and everyone's equal and everyone's the same thing. Well, I've yet to see that actually done in a way that makes any kind of logical sense, because it's one of those things where there's always going to be people who are more important, even if it is just like a communal thing of, oh well, we voted in this specific individual to or this council of people to speak on our behalf. Okay, well, that council is speaking for you, therefore they have much more political sway and geopolitical sway than just Bob your baker from down the road. Yeah, like, he has invested his political capital into that ruling council, therefore that ruling council is a different social class or political class. Yeah, so you don't really have a like classless society if you don't have some sort of like, hive mind or whatever. I don't see it happens. um like, Blue or Vic, you can, tell me I'm wrong or something, but it is very much a case where you get people who kind of come in and talk about the sort of, here's my extreme communist utopia where everyone's equal, but then nobody is. All the examples that we've had so far, weirdly, are the most like dystopian, social strated, like things ever.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the ideal, like the as come besides hive minds, the thing that is as communist as you can get is just sort of this like super decentralized network of communes where everyone like votes and everyone just produces for the sake of, of producing and takes what they need from the collective production. But that is such an ideal, like an idealized version of what actually happens that it's not really interesting or realistic. Like, okay, what happens if somebody just like takes all the merchandise that everyone's piled up in this communal pot and just sells it off? Eventually, you're gonna need somebody to like guard it, somebody to redistribute it, somebody to see if there's any shortfalls or surpluses in production. And even though those people might be elected, I mean, even though they might have a really communistic, like left wing way of deciding what the what's going to be the course of production, the ideal of literally of like from everyone according to their means and to everyone according to their needs doesn't really translate well when you're trying to create a country, like a large interstellar society, as we write in series. Of course, you can create like a village that works in on the principle.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those situations where, like, yes, you could try and do that, but it's one of those things where, like, if you've got a utopian society where everyone's happy and they take exactly according to like their needs but not their wants, and nobody acts out and everyone votes for the same thing and there's no class conflict and whatever, then like what are you doing? Because at that point just have a hive mind.
Yeah, that's why
And
it's
there's
literally a
no,
hive.
yeah,
Just
because there's no like internal play, there's no interesting interactivity. It's just like people doing the set thing again and again and again and again with no like deviation or individual like agency effectively. Um, so another extreme society would be something like a AI democracy or a virtual society. So AI democracies are ones where a large part of the society is controlled or at least helped overviewed by artificial intelligence. A key example of this is the Union of Worlds, my nation. This weirdly means that AIs can occupy a higher social strata than people, but don't actually have like the ability to move socially. They move with the people. Um, and while the AIs control the society, the people control the AI. So it's a very roundabout way of doing things. Uh, I don't really know how to like expand on it really, but it is definitely a kind of a one that breaks the typical mold of like these people are at the top and these people are at the bottom, for example. Yes, I did. I did predict managed democracy. The power of
like I
opinion
said,
can help you.
there's also like the really important difference of like what AI democracy means. Does it mean it's a democracy between AIs, or does it mean that that there's like human citizens who are affecting, essentially planning AI through their votes, which is almost like completely opposite societies, depending on what you mean.
Yeah, because the Union, for example, technically like yes, the AI control basically everything, but the people control the AI. So there's no like big upper class, so to say. There's no like established entrenched upper class who control everything because that's always changing and there's so much social mobility in the union that those at the top once they pass away don't pass on all of that wealth to their children and their families. So it's kind of this endlessly regenerating cycle. But those on the bottom also have like really good welfare and really good like available resources. So it's kind of this ever ascending ladder that's being managed by this AI that's in turn being managed by those on the ladder. So there's no like easy defined kind of like, oh, this is the bottom, this is the top sort of situation. Um, I don't really know other ways to put that, but that's kind of one example of I guess a more extreme society than the norm. Um, a fully virtual society of like pure AIs and instances would be, I guess, definitely an example of an extreme society. Um, but I still think that there would be a strata to that. You would have much more complex programs and much more complex AIs, you know, being at the top effectively.
Yeah, I think it will be stratified, but according to like different factors than a human society. Because the weird thing is that a virtual world that's inhabited by AIs, like the rhizomes or whatever, uh, it still has to pay for its server upkeeps. There is still like a physical cost of living. However, there is no notion of individual. Like, what is a citizen of the rhizome? Is it a code? Is it a code being executed? Is it an instance of that code being executed? Or is it like a whole bunch of like a combination of all? Because you cannot really precisely define an AI subject. And each rhizome in a series has chosen like a different solution. One of them says, okay, a citizen is like an individual in our rhizome is a single compiled piece of code, and all of their instances count as the same person. Meanwhile, some other rhizome might say, no, it's not the code, it's the actual like code being executed. So like if there's like 10,000 Anikas being processed in different computers, each one counts as a different individual, and each one has to pay for their server cost. And then there's like others that say that no, it's actually like the actual individual is neither the code nor the program being executed. It's actually the computer that's executing the code, and the AI is like a lower level function. So according to those rules, which are laid out in the quote unquote like constitutions of the rhizome, things varies extremely wildly, and your rights as an individual, if you're an AI within the rhizome, might vary completely from rhizome to rhizome. In general, though, you are expected to bring in more value than your server costs, than your computing cost. If I am an AI and I like just like calculate pi endlessly, or like factorize prime, like I try to find a prime number sequence, and I do this for myself. This takes massive amounts of computing, and I do it for no reason. This is going to take up server space that other AIs who have actual jobs helping people, or like creating art, or I don't know, giving you DoorDash food. Those AIs could be using the server space instead of me. So I'm gonna have to come up with a reason for what I should take the server space instead of them. And in general, that is given by that is determined by how useful you are, and how useful you are is expressed by how much money you can bring in, how much money you can give to the servers, and how much money you can have as a surplus. So it's really like when you get down to like the actual like deep rhizome, it is nothing like human society. There is no such thing as a continuous subject. There is no like this definition of citizen is wildly variable from place to place, and of course you don't have like a continuous existence. You can be like one AI that's copyrighted in some country that's been executed in 10,000 different places, all of which would have different rules.
Very good. I like it. Thank you, Vic. That's a nice explanation for virtual societies and the like. Any other extreme society types that we should cover? I'm trying to think of some.
There was another one mentioned earlier on.
Cults? I mean, I don't know if that's particularly extreme because at the end of the day, like,
Cults are a social phenomenon,
yeah,
but they're not societies in and of itself. When a cult becomes the dominant society, it's a theocracy.
non-national society. With it's just a society that doesn't have
Yes,
national.
there is, and that is actually one of the like weirder types of society that they are. Okay, so like, what is a national society? I will guess that it's a society that's defined that identifies through a nation state. I am from Belgium. I identify as Belgian. I speak the same language as other Belgian people, and I feel more related to like my neighbor than to somebody living in Mumbai or in Tokyo or in wherever. However, there might be societies which have cultural signifiers that are so strong that they override your national identity, that they and which are not localized. And this will be like an extreme and like almost like caricature version of fandoms or of like teams and virtual communities, not of AIs, but of like physical humans that feel more connected to each other than they feel to their actual physically present neighbors. So you could have this like community of people who all know each other, who all share like a kind of same orientation or taste or like a cultural inclination that ends up being more important in their lives than their actual national identity. And where that actually becomes a culture in and of itself is, what if those people who have formed a community online that is not spatially contiguous, what if they actually start sharing resources? Like, what if one of them gets sick and they have to get like a treatment that is really expensive, but because everyone empathizes with them, they all fundraise from this like decentralized grassroots movement. And what if they actually like pay for it? Now, but if you extend that into like a taxation system, where all members of the community just like voluntarily or coercively give money to the whole, now you get a society of people who think alike, but who are not necessarily like in the same place or in the same planet or who speak the same language. And you've created that like a non-national society. You've created like this big, self-sustaining, non-state actor that is supported by its members because they feel like it it is better and it answers more to their sense of identity than the actual country that they live in.
Yeah, and I think that you can see examples of that shared interest could be ethnicity, could be ideology, could be anything. I mean, if I made Ancerios into a like a oh you can pay me and we can put it into this big unified pot and we can pay for when somebody needs something particularly done, or anyone has any like legal bills that they need paid or medical bills or whatever, and we started doing that, like we would be a non-state actor, more or less.
Yeah, that will fall under the like a voluntarist non national society. However, now if you actually coerce people into giving their money to the whole, it becomes like a much weird and touchier subject because now you're like quote unquote forcing people to give money to this like decentralized whole, and there is gonna be you are gonna need somebody who decides where does this money go, and if there's a surplus, what does the surplus get invested in, and if there is a deficit, how are we gonna make up for it? So non-national societies or decentralized like non-state actors are like their own type of society.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that suggestion, Blue. Okay, all right. So I guess the next bit is good examples of societies in Ancerios. I already kind of went over the Union being a sort of an AI driven slash controlled economy and society and culture and all the sorts. Oh yeah, corporate ruled societies. Damn. All right, never mind. Go on, Vic. You probably know more about this than I do.
Do you mean corporatism or corporatocracy? Do you mean society ruled by the private sector, or do you mean like a society that has like fused the private and public sector into like this amalgamation of a nation?
I would say corporatocracy.
Okay, corporatocracy. Corporatocracy is only as much of a society as the actual corporation can make it be a society. There are corporations that operate that are very efficient and very good, but like 90% of the workforce is contractors who show up, work for a half a year, and then go away. That is not much of a society. However, there are other companies, which is other like corporate structures, such as in the old Zaibats of Japan, or the whatever in South Korea, that are much more akin to actual societies and that are extremely stratified and almost equivalent to a kind of like decentralized feudalism, I'd say, with like a different like corporate uh, levels replacing the nobility titles. They are, uh, however, a corporation has like no reason to hold onto territory. A corporation has no like fiduciary incentive to just make itself into a country that holds the monopoly of violence and taxes this planet, for example. A corporation can save itself a lot of effort and a lot of pain by simply just attaching itself to the regulatory environment of a government. if there is a corporation that feels like becoming an actual society, then there's got to be like an underlying reason for it. Like there's going to be some like cultural background to why it decided to do so. So, for example, I remember that in like Joseph Stiglitz book about globalization, he mentioned that there are some corporations in South Korea and Japan who are willing to eat up losses and to run out of laws for years rather than firing people, because it is more important than them to keep this community, to make themselves a society, than to turn a profit, because they think that keeping themselves as a society will eventually turn a profit in a long time. So in these corporations, Mitsubishi is a great example of it. Mitsubishi in the 70s, the cultural, social, and workplace aspects are like fused into each other in all sorts of ways that you wouldn't expect. Like for example, Mitsubishi used to hold like mass weddings between their employees. So maybe their employees didn't have enough money for a fancy wedding, but Mitsubishi said that's okay. We're gonna lump you with another 120 couples who also work for us. And we're gonna have this like massive dream wedding, and everyone's gonna celebrate. And it's gonna everyone's gonna get a day off and attend your wedding. And that actually like established a strong social bond between the people and the corporation. And they had, for example, like educate. They also ran schools. They also had like out of work activities, like the Mitsubishi Motor Club, or like the Rolls Royce chorus choir, which still exists. And Rolls Royce is actually a great example of that. In its prime, Rolls Royce was a corporation that ran a society. If you worked for Rolls Royce, you were taken care of 100%. Your children worked at a Rolls Royce school. When they graduated out of school, they went to like a Rolls Royce trade school, and they were paired up with a veteran like welder or whatever. There were like tennis clubs, there were rugby clubs, there were like artists of like the musical philharmonic, and it made everyone feel like really closely tied together. And it made every worker just say that okay, if I work for this group, I identify as with Rolls Royce as much as I identify with the United Kingdom. My children are just gonna work for Rolls Royce, and it worked until like the recession in the 70s, and Rolls Royce started cutting jobs left and right. On the other hand, you get corporations that are all about the just the immediate profit, where it's we're not building a society, we're not a family, we're not here to create a culture. We are going to make a precise calculation about your actual value contribution to the company, and as soon as it turns into negative, we're going to let you go, and we're going to bring a contractor. In fact, we're going to let everyone go and bring in only contractors. It's super optimization for the short term for stock value. So corporatocracy can vary wildly between these two states of being like an extremely like quasi state that organizes community around its main centers of production, like factories and cities or whatever. Or it can also be like this floating thing that just gravitates to where labor is cheaper, and where it can turn its biggest profit. Like ArcelorMittal. It existed in Central Europe for decades. Then found out that Indian labor was cheaper. Then it just straight up left because it didn't have like that culture of Rolls Royce or the Japanese Zaibatsu. So corporate societies can get you both extremes. However, in general, they will not want to just straight up become countries because that's expensive. And corporations ultimately are there to turn a profit.
Blue, you stole my example that I was going to bring up for note. One of the examples of a company basically going out of its way is Cadbury, the chocolatiers. They made Bourneville, which is the southwest side of Birmingham, and effectively the Cadbury brand built this big chocolate factory, and they built the entirety of Bourneville. All of its workers got a house. There were schools, there were recreational facilities. They built everything, and they funded it all. And it was everyone was really looked after, and it made the company into this like big kind of like powerhouse, effectively. And they had a lot of sway as well, if I remember correctly. But yeah, sorry, Vic, continue.
Yeah, I remember that in like a Cadbury or like Rolls Royceville, I forget its name. The corporations are not doing this because of some like present idealism. They're doing this because they think that raising like creating this tight knit workforce is going to like keep the expert workers working for them. It's going to help with institutional knowledge. It's going to help raise the next generation of workers, and it is going to help them like keep everything centralized and everything turning around the institution. And it might also like help them influence politics, because if all your workers are super happy and are and they identify very much with your workplace, then your union leadership or your executive leadership endorses a certain political candidate, people are probably going to like vote for them by default, which is going to affect the national politics or whatever your corporation is located in, and the corporation is gonna get a benefit. So they're not like doing it for like stupid idealistic good. They're doing it because it's a compromise between, okay, we're gonna give up some like immediate share value in exchange for still being the biggest chocolate factory or the biggest like a jet engine factory in 20 years. But you also get much more short-term minded companies that say, fuck all that. We actually need to raise Q3 results. We are gonna let go of all of these people. We're gonna decentralize our factories. We're gonna call on contractors, and our shareholders are gonna be satisfied. Like, we're actually gonna turn a profit, and we're actually gonna beat this old style corporation that is still trying to create its idyllic village. Because remember that like the Chocolateville and the old Rolls Royce town, that stuff used to work in the 50s and the 60s, when there was a lot of like capital controls and restriction on export. This works less in a completely globalized society. As soon as you give the company Rolls Royce or chocolate factory, as soon as you give them the choice, okay, are you gonna keep this like community going, or are you just gonna hire Chinese? Eventually, the Chinese just straight up win. Yeah, fuck all of that. Like we have calculated, we have made the conscious choice of just relocating to China because the workforce there is much cheaper. And when the Chinese become expensive, we go to Vietnam or Mexico. So the corporatocracy societies are constantly looking for the most efficient way of accomplishing their fiduciary goals, which is turning a profit for the creditors and for their shareholders. And whether that means creating a title knit community or whether that means like creating this like atomized don't give a fuck network of contractors that are always on the verge of losing their job depends 100% on the economic and regulatory conditions. There's an example of this in character, which is the Rangvold cartel corporations, which used to operate in the old way when all countries in Ancerious used to be more like closed and there was less trade. Yamanashi used to do all these like extravagant things for the workers. They used to like I said, they used to like hold weddings. They had like sports teams. They had huge rallies. They uplifted the more of the workforce because keeping the workforce happy meant that they were gonna have children, and then their children were gonna be like practically born into the corporation and work for the corporation. However, after the Second Ancerious War, when the galaxy like globalized, Yamanakaku just like got liquidated. Yamanashi, sorry, Yamanashi got liquidated and got reorganized into Yamanakaku. And Yamanakaku was operating in a completely different economic social environment because now it didn't have to rely on these tightly knit communities of extremely loyal workers. Now it could just like semi uplift some culture of tribesmen and say, yeah, if you like stamp steel, we're gonna pay you 25 cents an hour, and it's enough to like buy you like a quarter bag of rice. And to those people who used to live in mega poverty, that seemed like the boon of plenty. So they accepted the contract. And little by little, Yamanakaku shifted from this like real community-centered mode of operation, which it inherited from Yamanashi, to this completely like decentralized, fluctuating mode of operation, where everyone is all the time in fear of losing their jobs. And they didn't do it to be evil. They didn't do it to like for like fuck the people were a company. They just did it because it was the most like profitable way of operating. That's it.
Thank you for a very detailed breakdown of corporatocracies.
I do want to chime in before we move on about we've mentioned that there's paternalist sort of company structures or societies where it's about if we provide this and that, then they'll be incentivized to help out and they'll identify with us more. And then there's also the complete opposite of that, which is a constantly shifting kind of just always looking for the most immediate statistical one. What's not mentioned is this is a kind of something in between, which was very prevalent in the United States during the 1800s at the height of the sort of robber baron era, where you had essentially both. You had societies forming around these companies where you had company stores and so forth, especially around mining towns, where essentially a company, because it could own the stores and the local employment sectors and the schools and all this kind of thing within an area, they could basically force their local workforce to work for them, who would then give them the wages who would then go to the stores because they were the only stores available to provide it back. So you had this kind of quote voluntary society that looks like the Cadbury kind of system, but it's more like they were holding them hostage because they held all the local capital available and all the employment opportunities and all the education sectors. And because of that, they were able to, once they had established control, basically throttle the society into being, well, kind of like their workforce was being held hostage. So I think it's just worth mentioning that you can have something in between there where you have this corporate paternalist society, but it's same sort of mantra and ethics as the pushing for the bottom line, scummy corporate mentality.
Excelente. So, I don't know if I really need to go over examples of societies, because we've actually gone over several so far with My, Union, Natar, and Yamanakako. Or Yamanashi, or whatnot. What are some good examples that you guys think would cover? Trying to think. I guess Capital would be a very good example of like a heavily stratified top-down society with the whole thing of Strixism and controlling the workforce and controlling and to maximize the output of the workforce through various surveillance means and otherwise. Yep. EOS would be a good example of a theocratic society with their basic like society effectively being completely orientated around religion and the priesthood. The priesthood being there's kind of two religious sects in EOS. There's there's the Synod, which is, I guess, the more civilian side that deals with the day-to-day religious control and running of the economy and the internals. And then you've also got the Exemplars, who are the martial side of things, but they're both integrated into the theocratic religion aspect. So the church and state are completely like one and the same. Carnath would be a very good example between a corporatocracy and a monarchy, where you've got, instead of these individual kind of private corporations that are providing all of these different things, these private corporations are actually like noble houses within a greater kind of like nation itself. So they almost act like small national corporatocracies inside of this big nation state, which is then run by this sort of like main ruling house as a monarch. The Selenicans definitely would be a good overview again of an authoritarian heavy surveillance state, focusing around bits and pieces like that, where it's the top basically control the absolute majority. Technocracies. Okay, so this is getting into like, I guess, society types again. What the question is, what do you, Jaeger, seeing as you're posing this forward, what do you count as a technocracy? Because I can tell you right now that every modern day society is a technocracy. By definition. So I know that technocracy gets thrown around a lot in sci-fi RP, but like, okay, so a technocracy being a civilization whose uppermost leading body is a group of technical experts at a specific thing. Like, each leader is a specialist at different things. That is a normal modern day democracy. Or what it's
Problem is
supposed
that you need like a benchmark to know who is an expert on what.
Yeah. Because I guess modern societies are supposed to be a meritocracy, and a technocracy is exactly the same as a meritocracy, whereas the individuals who have the most merit in certain subjects, aka those who know the most about their chosen subjects, should be, theoretically, voted in and elected to those specific positions so they can bring the most of their specialization and knowledge to bear. But obviously, things are different in the real world and whatnot, but like technocracy and meritocracies are basically the same thing, which then again is kind of the same thing with like generic democracies, or even kind of like, I mean, you can have meritocracies that are authoritarian. It's always the case of like, inverted commas, in an ideal situation, you would always want your ruling body to be the best that they can possibly be in those specific instances. Obviously, that's not always the case, but like, I don't ever see. I don't see technocracies being their own distinct society. It's just a like a political decision of the state.
I would say that the problem with like the concept of a technocracy or a meritocracy is that it implies that there is like a higher body that determines who is qualified or who is worthy of holding a certain post. So, for example, you have a technocracy in which the Minister of Health or the Minister of Internal Affairs needs a postgraduate advanced degree on psychology or like whatever, or public health and safety or whatever fuck. But then you just like in practice, that means that you're handing the power to whoever can grant degrees in health and public safety. So is it really a technocracy when you're just like moving the power to grant somebody a post from the electoral body to just this like random university? And then you gotta think, who rules the university? How are the exams run? Who by what criteria are your citizens being evaluated? Like it's easy to think in the abstractly, like yeah, the Minister of Health should be a doctor, and it should only be a doctor. But then you gotta ask, okay, so what are my medicine schools like? Who runs them? What's the examination like?
And more
Who funds them?
Who can influence that? Because again, if you're handing over your control of your nation, which is supposed to be about like, X person should have X thing for this, well, you're handing over that to a specific body of individuals. Well, who gets to choose those individuals? And if that's the case, whoever's on the board of that university can then be influenced, and it's just as prone to people who have absolutely no merit whatsoever being elected to those positions as just a regular democracy that we have like in the modern day. You're just, instead of it being like the typical instances that we find where corruption is sort of accumulated and where people can get influenced, you're just moving that around to different areas of the society rather than kind of eliminating it altogether.
Yeah, so I would say like technocracy that doesn't really exist as it's kind of a meme form of a societal organization because it doesn't really mean anything if you really think about it too hard. Like anyone eventually can become a leader under a technocracy.
Okay, so
You just have to like rig a different game.
I guess this moves on to questions, I guess. Although, Boomer, you said you wanted to talk about a specific society, I think,
Yeah,
as an example.
yeah. I was gonna give an example discussing one of the long-term projects I've been working on called Corrosion, or the Corrosions. The Corrosions are a good good example, I would say, of the ways that a non-national based society can create some very interesting interactions between other groups and especially other societies that view themselves through the lens of national affiliation. They are a semi-nomadic diaspora culture of native humans that are found across the galaxy and found both in independent sort of groups or found inside of nations such as Navi, Cerulia, the CA, Barcialo, the ASA, and a number of other ones as well. Um, they are a society that is predominantly viewing themselves through the lens of clan affiliations, through this concept of larger extended families and sort of pseudo blood familial connections, as well as the lens of religion, in which the greater extent of corrosion culture in society is determined by those within a specific religious belief network. You have individuals in corrosion cultures like clans and such who may have diverging dialects of language, diverging histories, diverging cultures, diverging political concepts, but they are usually united as a sort of like singular group, viewing each other as members of a singular sort of culture or society by the sense that they kind of view each other through their sort of continuous and common religious affiliation and religious goals. Um, their most interesting stuff has come when other players have decided to include them as a minority autonomous group within their nation. The idea that corrosions are found often by many nations within them, either as a group that existed there before the area was colonized, or a group that came in and either partially, fully, or not at all integrated in, but will not leave for some specific reason. For example, within Navi, the corrosions there are found on the world of Krail and are, because of that world's unique history and political culture, have experienced some of the largest amount of integration among corrosion clans. Well, in Barcialo, Lucy's nation, they have experienced extreme amounts of persecution and are actively rebelling against the government, seeing them as imperialists who are attacking their homeland. There's a large amount of in between of that, but you can see this sort of cultural group that exists that has a very different way of viewing themselves, but begin to conflict, interact, and sort of engage with cultures that view themselves through a very different lens. And when these two societies meet and their differing views kind of like interact with each other, it can create synthesis or it can create conflict. And it has a chance to net very interesting stories. So I guess my suggestion from that in sort of like this culture is if you are writing a culture that has a very different view of the world than maybe other ones do, you are going to have an area ripe for sort of cultural synthesis and conflict when you interact with a group that differs from that. In the real world, there are plenty of examples in which different societies with very, very different connotations and views of reality interact. And when those interactions happen, it can lead to members of those societies sort of beginning to have different views, synthesizing the two views, or can lead to massive amounts of conflict or insecurity. It's a really fun thing to play around with, and it's a very real thing we see in the real world. So I totally suggest looking into that. It'd be an incredibly cool thing for NRPs and especially different RPs between two very different sort of cultural and societal groups.
Cool. Thank you, Boomy. Blue, you said that there is an aspect that we haven't touched on yet. Go for it.
Yeah, there was just a small aspect. It was quite a while ago. It was just talking about like one thing that can kind of give a bit more of an individuality to how a society works, and it comes kind of into culture and the interplay between history, culture, and the actual system that a society works by. Is if you look at a lot of countries like say America or the United Kingdom and so forth, they might have a similar system, but there might be a certain quirk or something that comes from their culture that actually affects how society works. So, for instance, in the UK, we have a tradition of stoicism, like the British stiff upper lip, and this is caused compared to Europe in history, where you had like the 1840s revolutions and so forth. Britain was largely kept out of these like instabilities because our society has a tradition of kind of just putting faith in the system and using democracy and slow reforms and so forth, which has caused a slow burn in kind of how our society's evolved compared to others. And that's one side of that has been that it's had a lot more of a peaceful side, but also that, like I said, things have changed a lot slower. America, the way that their society came about as an independent one, is obviously that they were an ideological revolution which basically platformed itself on liberty. And so almost every aspect of their society, when they propose a change, they will try and platform the idea of liberty into it. Like if it's socialism or some kind of aspect, it's that liberty can't be realized unless there are certain rights that are underpinned, like the right to food or the right to work. Otherwise, people's liberties are inhibited. So even when it goes against something, they will try and play up this core part of their society because they hold it so closely to their society's existence. In a lot of authoritarian societies today, like China and Russia, at least from my experience, they have a long kind of society like history of not being that involved in their governments. Like at least when I was in China, you like they just didn't really have much idea what was going on in their governments. Even though they were good people and they were interested in stuff, because they didn't really have that societal like history of involving themselves in the politics, they themselves weren't that engaged in the modern day, and that gave way to how their systems worked. So these kind of small things about how their societies work or look at things can impact not just the system you have, but how that system works or how well it works. So it was just something that I wanted to bring up. That's a worthwhile thing to consider.
Yeah, that's cool. So, Anna asks a question: how would you go about writing a society with a sort of double think, be it enforced or a cultural thing springing up over time, or what have you? How would you have it without coming off as contradictory on the part of the writer? Um, I think it would basically be a case of, you would pretty much have to write it as a case of kind of like a narration thing. You can show it from a character's point of view as contradictory, and you can even have the character acknowledge that it's contradictory, but they go along with it because it's a normative thing for that culture. Yeah? Like, I don't know if you've ever read 1984. You have? Cool. So acknowledge that like people will talk about it and such, but it's kind of that state of, yes, there is double think and double speak going on, and people are aware of it, but they don't want to rock the boat because like everything's kind of okay for them at the moment, and they're aware of it happening and they're aware that it exists, but they don't like screw around with it. You know what I mean? They don't push back. It's like a massive thing in their day-to-day lives. That way you don't have to like literally write double speak and double think and then have like sort of to just ignore it for the reader or whatnot to make it confusing. Yes, there are prominent nations with an Ankh that have experienced significant cultural shock to the point of civil war and political collapse. Capital, the Grand Empire of Capital got invaded in 2AW and occupied after they were surrendered. They went from a extremely authoritarian kind of almost dynastic kind of fascist dictatorship to this like really kind of conservative democracy that then in turn collapsed and went into a civil war between a very giga authoritarian surveillance state that's focused around production output and societal, cultural and personal control along with a like resurgence of the old like warlord dynasties, and then they became like warlords and feudalistic in their regards to what they're doing. Natar as well. Yeah, as Blue says in the chat, basically they were isolationists for ages, and then they got attacked, and then it flipped, and then effectively, like, the government fell through, and they became much more, not united in terms of, like, all the nations joining together as one, but there was a lot more unification in terms of, how the overall society, took a front to geopolitical galactic affairs, basically. Yeah, made them hyper-capitalist, free trade, deregulated, etc. Do societies have prejudice against one another in Ancerios? Yes. Take your pick. There are plenty of people who are quite prejudiced against different species or societies. The Union of Worlds and the Grand Empire of Capital, or whatever their descendants are, tend to pretty much fucking hate each other because they've been at war for well over 100 years. You're going to have just a million different examples of that based on ideological differences. For example, natives and colonials is the main one. Some colonials hate the natives, some natives hate the colonials, based on ideological or cultural or even like day-to-day occurrences where, the colonials are doing a specific thing to fuck over the natives or vice versa. So yeah, it's pretty key on that one. Any other questions? Yeah, a lot of the super advanced nations don't really like the short-lived mortal nations who are quite low tech. They think that they're mud huggers, basically. They're more trouble than they're worth. Any other questions? How would you give tips on how not to do a society? Basically, we already discussed the whole, like, oh, well, they don't have a set class society and everyone's equal and blah, 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 blah. Is all a bit bullshit. I also would not I also would recommend not writing societies as some sort of like cohesive monoblock entity which doesn't change regardless of what happens in the terms of external and internal affairs. Like, there is going to be political change, there is going to be economic change, there is going to be like cultural change, therefore that is going to affect your society. You're going to move, maybe swinging on the individualist or the collectivist aspect, blah, 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 blah. Like, there's going to be things that are going on that's going to affect your society as a main factor. And if you can't integrate that, then that is kind of like, I guess, the cardinal sin, really. Society shouldn't be perfect, effectively. What ways can cause societies to evolve? So we've turned the whole thing about like external factors and internal factors, but there can be other factors as well, like the development of certain technologies. For example, modern day nations, we can say that the Industrial Revolution caused a massive change in society, just like how the development of a faster than light drive would, or cost effective space travel, would affect a nation to the point where it would probably change its society, to reflect a sudden overabundance of accessible resources on other planets or other star systems. Globalization has been a major driving factor in the modern day and in the last, like 40, 50 years, just as it would be in Ancerios. If you suddenly got access to the open market in the Ancerios galaxy, that would change your society because you can get access to new technologies, you can get access to FTL fuel, information, just all sorts. It would be completely revolutionary. And another thing that could potentially cause a society to evolve are things like magic and psionics. Because, as we talked about in the last kind of big discussion on magic and before that with psionics, things like that are going to fundamentally change, your culture, your government, everything is going to affect your society, and those would cause it to evolve into a new form that could more readily accept and engage with those new developments effectively. Um, so yeah, and can a society regress? And is there any examples of that? Yeah, well, capital was an example. That absolutely regressed back to feudalistic warlord people. What other examples are there in Ancerios of regression? Societal regression. I guess Aurelia? Aurelia would be an example of societal regression in terms of
Corona.
Corona as well. I know that Aurelia basically used to be this really progressive native that wanted to trade and have really good relations with the colonials, and then they got screwed over in the first Ancerios War, and they never really recovered, and there was just constantly sort of like coups, civil wars, etc., until eventually the extremists won, and they then blamed everything on the colonials, and they regressed into this ultra sort of conservative, traditional, focused, we're going to take down the colonials and enact our revenge nation, where the citizens didn't really have any rights, and they just, did whatever for the state. Do you want to explain Coronavic?
Oh well, I mean, Corona basically did nothing but regress for a couple millennia, because the First Republic was the Overmind. It is like a retroactive name that it never assumed itself. But the First Republic was this like a galactic whole under the Overmind. Then the Overmind shattered, and humanity became its own like independent conscious structure. And that was Second Republic. Second Republic was all of humanity in Ancerious, connected to the fragment of perseverance, of self-preservation. And then this fragment became weaker and weaker, and since all the coronas were linked to it, they either had to like stay linked to it and rot with it, or cut their link with it and assume full subjectivity, which is kind of like abandon your god, abandon this like a voice in your head that's giving you directions, and try and find your own destiny. And most of humanity did. The ones that didn't were this like rum state in this forgotten corner of the galaxy in the inner halo, which became the Third Republic, and they continued to rot with it long after the fragment of self-preservation had lost its sentiency. So it is a state that started off as this like a hive mind, then became probably some form of consensus-based democracy, or a really extremely like federated territory all over Ancerious. Then it just like different chunks of its government fell apart until it became like this degenerate, awful critter that was both extremely tyrannical, but also unable to like actually do anything effectively.
Nice, thank you. So Anna asks, how do you rectify a discrepancy between a nation's technological state and its societal structure? Good question, I guess. I mean,
But I mean that's gonna generate like a social tension. If there is like a discrepancy between how your society is organized and the technological means of your society, that is going to create an internal tension. that is gonna have to be resolved one way or the other. For example, like an example of that is the first capital empire, which was like a full feudalistic system. Lords own pieces of territory in which their serfs work, and they cannot move, and they give their surplus to them. In exchange, the Lord protects them. So this kind of started like it started falling apart with the fact that they were industrial. That instead of being like fields where they grew potatoes or whatever, it was factories, and it was like really specialized factories that needed to be integrated with each other. But since the land was like shattered into 10 million feuds, the economy was really inefficient, and there was a ton of like economic potential that was being lost. And this was recognized by the higher nobility and the empress and the five noble families, who said like these people, like this lower nobility, are just getting in the way. They are like fracturing our territory internally, and they are setting up all sorts of barriers to our development. So we're gonna have to get rid of them. And that was the ascent of that was the crux of the ascent of Empress Inara, who got rid of all of like these internal divisions of like these duchies or like marks and whatevers, and centralized the whole thing as no, all of capital is imperial territory, and I am the empress, and I get to like horizontally integrate all of this infrastructure, so that now when a mine mines like iron ore, and this gets refined into steel, and the steel gets refined into super alloy. It doesn't have to pass through like 15 different like duchies or baronies or whatever, each one charging its own tax. No, it goes straight to the factory, because all of this territory belongs to me. I am the empress, period. And that's how she got rid of the feudalistic system. There were still some leftovers which she did not manage to fully get rid of, such as the system of slavery, which she reduced, she worked against, because she would much rather have workers than slaves that need to be taken care of, and they need to like be housed and fed constantly. But she kind of like struck a middle ground. She like pushed as far as she could, and eventually the internal tensions of Inara systems got resolved by the internal cooperative of Incandescence after the Capital Civil War, which just like fully integrated both the government and the production into the same body that is born out of a trade union, but you cannot really call it a trade union. It is this like hybrid, like totalitarian entity that crosses over very easily from private to public, from like territorial to international. So the way that it evolves is by like or like the way that a discrepancy influences society is that sooner or later it's gonna have to get resolved, either violently or through compromise through the people who benefit from each side. In capital, of course, it's like violence all the way. But our societies have like a transition more easily from different states.
Yeah, cool. All right. I think that's all the questions. So, awesome. Thank you all very much for coming, and we will catch you next time.